Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. Pretty much everyone who hasn't already drunk the Kool-Aid should be able to tell that things are not exactly rosy in the land of Oz. The legal abolition of sex in the family, 70,000 jobs and counting axed at the flourish of a pen, no conceivable end now to the never-ending lockdowns even in sight anymore. And perhaps even worst of all, the normalization of objective evil.
You know, Chinese leaders, if you know anything about Chinese history, it has always been the time when China has been victimized by the outer world is when they haven't been unified at home. So the central, to vastly overstated, the central principle of Xi Jinping is that there must be a united, tightly controlled China. And he uses his rationale for the things he does based on that. I point out to him, no American president can be sustained as a president if he doesn't reflect the values of the United States. And so the idea, I'm not going to speak out against what he's doing in Hong Kong, what he's doing with the Uyghurs in western mountains of China, and Taiwan trying to end the one China policy by making it forceful. I said, and by the way, he said he gets it. Culturally, there are different norms at each country, and their leaders are expected to follow.
It's something you've got to see to believe. Things would be bad, but they wouldn't be nearly as intolerable if there was an opposition movement dedicated to opposing not just these policies and decrees, but the underlying philosophy that's powering them. A movement that was content not just in opposing the left, but in actually checkmating them. You're probably thinking, Nate, we've already got that. It's called the American right, a feisty conglomeration of conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals, and independent thinkers who are sick and tired of identity politics and soft totalitarianism, and who have devoted themselves to preserving freedom and democracy throughout the West. Yeah, I wish that conglomeration actually existed. I mean, it does, certainly on paper, but the unfortunate truth, gang, is that behind all the intents and purposes and speechifying and chest thumping is that the contemporary American right is pretty much a paper tiger. And that holds true for both the American conservative establishment and what I have come to term the American conservative estabulary. The establishment is what we would think of as the old guard. Institutions like the Heritage Foundation, publications like National Review, and people like David French. And to give the devil his due, the conservative establishment is the cornerstone of modern conservatism, whether you like it or not. It was, for example, Bill Buckley's National Review, created in 1955, that really solidified the post-war New Right movement, stitching together divergent threads of thought on the American right, from libertarian Frank Meyer to the more traditionally based and self-professed defender of the permanent things, Russell Kirk, making them into a sword that could be wielded against the USSR, as well as a wall from which they could all stand atop and yell, "Stop!" to American liberals. Those days, long gone. Now, by and large, the establishment is just an ally of the left. For example, take the aforementioned David French, who, since 2015, has been one of the preeminent and unofficial leaders of the Never Trump movement. Now, me personally, I don't care that French has been an inexhaustible opponent of Donald Trump. People can support and oppose politicians however they see fit. But when that opposition loses all grounds in reality, it ceases to be opposition and becomes instead madness. Take, for example, French's latest piece in Time magazine, he being one of the few people on the right who has the privilege of getting published in Time magazine, whose headline said, quote, "Trump's acquittal exposed a republic in peril." Melodramatic titles aside, as well as the question as to whether former presidents can even be impeached or not, parts of French's essay are actually quite correct, as when he points out that years of willing Congresses ceding their power to the federal bureaucracy has brought us to a point where one person, or I would say one system, like said bureaucracy, can actually dominate the entire government and ignore all those pesky checks and balances that the framers put into the Constitution. But then he says this. That's exactly why overwhelming majorities of Republicans knew their job was to vote against Donald Trump's impeachment and acquittal. Even though his lies about the election, his incitements at the January 6th rally, and his failure to speak out immediately against the violence when it was clear that the Capitol was being breached put their lives in danger. Nowhere does French mention the bombshell story that the same Time magazine published just a few weeks before his own essay, in which it was admitted that a secret cabal of left-wing activists, CEOs, representatives of foundations and donors, as well as institutions like Planned Parenthood and Greenpeace, conducted a quote-unquote shadow campaign, Time's words, not mine, which swung the 2020 election their way by getting state election laws changed, by convincing millions of people to vote by mail for the very first time. A process that is so open to manipulation that Jeff Bezos personally opposed vote by mail when it was going to affect him personally and his profits, and pressured social media companies to restrict misinformation. In other words, there was a well-oiled, executed plan which neutered Republican self-government. But as far as I can tell, by browsing through French's Twitter feed, as well as some of the other pieces that he's written, he's given this story by Time magazine exactly 0 attention. In addition, we now know that the old canard that Trump incited a riot and or insurrection has about as much basis in truth as the very fine People hoax. Writing in the Claremont Review of Books, Charles Kessler looked at what Trump actually said on January 6th in context and came to the inescapable conclusion that there was no inciting to riot and no prodding to insurrect. Instead of promoting violence, Trump actually gave a very dry, run-of-the-mill speech in which he said that congressional Republicans who shirked their duty and did the wrong thing would not be remembered kindly by history. And then he encouraged his followers and supporters to primary them in the next election. Oh, heaven to Betsy. How will the Republic ever survive such heated rhetoric? And it's not just individuals. Pedro Gonzalez, writing at the online American Greatness magazine, detailed some of the blatant hypocrisy conducted by old guard conservative establishment institutions. One of the primary examples he gave was the Texas Public Policy Forum, which has repeated the conservative mantra that the government shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers in the open market. Instead, the government's role is to act as an umpire. The problem, however, as Gonzalez points out, that some of the biggest donors to the TPPF are companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron, companies that have not only made fortunes in fossil fuels, but which have also been heavily subsidized by the federal government. If I had to boil down the establishment's Achilles heel in one word, it would be ideology. And to be clear, the establishment was already infected with ideology before the 2016 election. More and more, it was insisting that 21st century problems could, at least in part, be solved through solutions from the 80s. Notice, for example, how many times the Republican Party has offered tax cuts as the solution to a myriad of problems. It also maintained that it was completely rational to believe that you could spread freedom and democracy to parts of the world that had absolutely no history or tradition for freedom or democracy. All you had to do was rearrange some governmental structures and voila, just like magic. This while at the same time largely waving the white flag in the culture wars here at home, giving up on, for example, marriage and making the family subject to the economy. The attack on their worldview and the loss of influence that Trump's win in the 2016 election represented just entrenched their ideology further. The conservative estabulary, the new guard of Ben Shapiro's, Dave Rubin's, Ally Beth Stuckey's, Glenn Beck's, Blaze TV's, Daily Wire's, Turning Point USA's, is a slightly different nut. Its main problem isn't necessarily ideology, though there are elements of that definitely in it, but a lack of deep philosophical roots. The estabulary, for example, bellows about free speech, free association, free enterprise, freedom of religion, with a garnished cherry of socialism sucks on the top of this voluptuous shake. But that is exactly where the conversation ends. Now, don't misunderstand me here, gang. Those things that I just listed are good and important, and Yeah, socialism indeed does suck. But why are these things important and good? Why, to give a specific example, is free speech good? I suspect that a lot of people in the estabulary would answer that question by saying freedom itself is good, duh, and that if you don't have free speech, it's a sign that you live in an authoritarian society. The problem with that answer, however, is that it only pushes the question back another step, because now we have follow-up questions, such as, why is freedom good? What is the essence of a freedom? The first one might seem to be simple. Freedom is good because control is bad. But does this mean that all control is intrinsically bad, even self-control that we put upon ourselves? You would think not, because this would seem to push against the idea of virtue, which figures in the estabulary will still occasionally give a hat tip to, like Ben Shapiro did at the 2018 Politicon, which was the very first one I attended, in which you can actually still go back and hear my thoughts on here, if for no other reason than to see how the production and the content of this channel has at least marginally improved in 2+ years. So if all control is not intrinsically bad, then freedom cannot mean just doing whatever it is that you want to do. Which then leads us to that second hypothetical question, what is the essence of freedom? But this is a question that no one in the estabulary has really touched upon, and that no one in the estabulary is going to touch upon. Because actually grappling with that question would open up an entire factory of worms. If that second question was grappled with, the conclusion might be reached that freedom has a specific nature or essence which actually complements our human nature. But then this would mean that not everything that we desire or want is illicit, even if it's legal. And that means that the conservative movement would be put in the unenviable position of actually telling people that freedom cannot be used as a cover for getting whatever that you want. It might require the estabulary, for example, to say that freedom doesn't give you the ability or the right to realign, reform, rearrange institutions like marriage and the family simply to accommodate what you want them to be. It might have to argue that things which have been declared to be protected parts of free speech, like flag burning and pornography, are not only not parts of free speech, but have absolutely no place in civilization itself. And it might actually have to resurrect Wilmore Kendall's observation that there are some issues so basic, so primordial, that they cannot be questioned, because in questioning them, you inevitably simply give society a knife with which it can cut its own wrists. But I can tell you right now, gang, that that is not going to happen, because it's so much easier just to go with a shallow definition of freedom that can be printed on a t-shirt and which can win debates with college students than to actually take the time and the energy to internalize a complex, sophisticated, and more importantly, substantial and deep understanding of freedom, similar to the one that our founders had. This is why we've reached the point where the wunderkind himself, Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk, can attack the philosophical idea of the common good, or the general welfare, as the framers called it, as an abject enemy of freedom and natural rights, even though Western philosophy has traditionally maintained that the common good is a vital component for a free, flourishing, and just society. This is why Ali Beth Stuckey has not only defended flag burning, but also the removal of history if it's the right sort of history to be removed. This is why Steven Crowder on Instagram in 2019 said that if you are for the government banning anything, then you are a fake conservative. It's why Kathy Zhu in 2019, also on Instagram, made the chronological snob's argument when she stood aghast that there were still conservatives in 2019 who opposed gay marriage. It's reached the point that neither side of the conservative coin can actually be reformed. There are too many lifelines in these movements now by too many powerful people. If the establishment and or the estabulary were reformed, those livelihoods, those limelights would be lost completely. On top of that, many of the everyday common people who make up the American right have become comfortable with the way that the right operates, or at the very least, they've gotten used to how business is conducted. We've been inundated now for so many years that this is the only way to operate that it's getting harder and harder and harder to break out of the pigeonhole that the contemporary right has squished us down into. And if people actually do try to break out of that pigeonhole, they're crushed. Remember the so-called Groypers, the alliance of people on the right who actually started challenging Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro by asking them questions about immigration and the right's ceding of the culture to the left. They were called racists and homophobes. Now, you might disagree with how they phrased, formulated, or presented their questions, but being called a racist simply for asking why unlimited legal immigration is a good thing for a country? Homophobic simply for asking why the right has seemingly abandoned Christian morality altogether while at the same time continuing to pay it lip service? Sounds more like to me as if the roosting powers didn't want their position in the hierarchy to be challenged. This is why the American right can no longer be reformed. Instead, it has to be reborn. Now, this is not going to be an easy or a quick process because it's going to require a completely different outlook in pretty much every field of life, from education to how we network to even how we look at the world or the left in particular. I repeat, it is going to be painful and it is going to be slow. In the myth of the phoenix, the mystical bird lived for 500 or 1,000 years. Different variations of the story say different things. And then, only after it was crushed by the weight of centuries, could it actually burst into flame in order to be reborn. In other words, it was a very slow and it was a very painful process, but one that was absolutely necessary for the phoenix to be given new life again. And that is now what the right must do. Crushed by decades of ideological and shallow thinking, it has to self-immolate in order to fly again. Now, I could actually start talking about how we begin this rebirthing process, but I would only be able to scratch the merest surface at the tail end of this video, which is why our next video is going to be completely dedicated to actually what we can start doing in order to begin that cycle rolling. I'll see you then, gang. In the meantime, stay safe and stay free by daring to read, think, speak, and write. Ciao.